Before dawn, a sleepless son answers his sister's forward text and follows a trail of photographs, a key, and a cabin by Clearwater Lake. As their father vanishes into silence, the siblings face the family's rippling rug of secrets, and the cost of finally lifting it. When I think back on that autumn morning, the first thing that comes to mind is the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the way the kitchen light looked a little too bright for how tired I felt. I had woken up before sunrise because sleep had become more of an idea than an activity lately. I sat there with a mug of coffee that had already gone lukewarm, staring at the same text message on my phone that I had read maybe 100 times since last night. It was from my sister, and it simply said that she needed to talk. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, just those 4 words that always seem to carry trouble when they come from her. To understand why that message hit me the way it did, you have to know what my family is like. We are the sort of people who pretend everything is fine even when it is burning. My parents built a home out of politeness and guilt, and my sister and I grew up learning how to sweep things under the rug so neatly that we almost forgot they were there. Almost. The thing about rugs, though, is they start to ripple after a while, and those ripples eventually trip you. I had not seen my sister in 3 years. The last time was at our mother's birthday dinner, where she announced between bites of cheesecake that she was moving back into town with her new fiancé. I remember the way my mom's eyes lit up and my dad tried to hide his relief behind his glass of wine. I tried to match their enthusiasm, but my stomach was twisting because I had not forgotten the reason she left in the first place. She had walked out after a fight that left the air in the house too heavy to breathe. That fight was about money technically, but really it was about everything else we never said. The text she sent me now was not about money, though. I could feel that. There was a tone in those 4 words that sounded like the calm before a familiar storm. I put my phone down and stared at the small pile of unopened mail on the counter. One of the envelopes had her handwriting on it from last month. She had sent me a letter for the first time in years. I had not opened it. I told myself I would get around to it, but the truth is I was afraid of what might be inside. Some letters, you can sense, are not meant to be read but to unload guilt. When the sun finally crept over the hill behind my street, I decided I would go see her. Curiosity has a way of winning over caution when it comes to family. I showered, shaved, and tried to look like someone who had his life together. I even wore the jacket she bought me years ago when we were still speaking, which felt ironic but also right. The drive to her apartment was short yet felt longer than it should have. The trees had started to lose their color, and the roads were littered with leaves that scraped against the asphalt as if whispering reminders of time passing. I rehearsed a dozen different ways to start the conversation, but each one sounded rehearsed, so I gave up. When I parked outside her building, the first thing I noticed was that the window on the 2nd floor had a string of lights hanging even though it was only October. She always had a habit of decorating too early, as if she could force warmth into a space before winter arrived. When she opened the door, she looked smaller than I remembered. Her face carried the same familiar features, but softer, somehow like time had eroded some of her sharpness. She smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. We exchanged that awkward half-hug that people give when they are not sure if they are still allowed to care. Then she gestured for me to come in, and I followed her through a narrow hallway that smelled faintly of coffee and old paint. She poured 2 cups of tea, and we sat at a small kitchen table cluttered with unopened mail and a few photographs spread face down. I asked her how she had been, and she said fine, the way people say fine when it means nothing. I nodded and said the same. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of a small clock on the wall and the clinking of her spoon against the cup. Then she looked at me and said something that made my stomach drop. She said she needed my help because Mom had told her something she could not handle alone. And that was the moment I realized this was not going to be a simple visit. I remember the exact way she said it because her voice trembled just enough to make me set my cup down before I spilled it. She told me that Mom had called her the night before sounding confused and out of breath, and that she had mentioned something about Dad keeping secrets. My sister said she tried to get details, but Mom hung up mid-sentence, which of course made her panic, and that panic somehow landed in my lap as soon as I walked through her door. I wanted to believe this was an exaggeration because she had a long history of turning small things into earthquakes, but something about her eyes told me this time was different. She pushed one of the photographs across the table face up. It was an old picture of Dad standing in front of a small cabin near a lake. The image looked familiar, yet I could not remember ever visiting that place. On the back of the photo, someone had written a date that went back more than 20 years. I asked her where she got it and she said Mom had sent it to her in an envelope with a short note that read simply, "I think he went back there." I could see the worry building in her face as she tried to piece together what that might mean. Our father was a quiet man, the kind of person who preferred fixing things around the house to talking about them. Growing up, I always thought that silence was strength, but as I got older I started to realize it was more of a shield. He had whole worlds locked behind that calm exterior, and he never invited anyone in, not even Mom. I wondered if this photo and that message were fragments of one of those hidden worlds finally breaking through. I told my sister that we should go to the house to check on Mom just in case. She agreed so quickly that I could tell she had been waiting for me to say it. Before we left, she grabbed the envelope and tucked it into her bag as if it were a piece of evidence. The drive to our parents' place took nearly an hour, and for most of it we sat in silence. The roads were mostly empty, the trees bending slightly under a steady wind. I kept my eyes on the road, but my thoughts kept drifting to that photo and the look on Mom's face when she used to talk about Dad's fishing trips from years ago. When we finally pulled into the driveway, the house looked smaller than I remembered. It is funny how childhood homes shrink when you see them through adult eyes. The curtains were drawn and the porch light was still on even though it was late morning. I knocked once, then twice before using my key. Inside, the air felt still and heavy, like a room that had been sealed for too long. Mom was sitting in her favorite armchair staring at the television, which was turned off. She looked up slowly when we walked in, and her expression was blank for a moment before recognition settled in. She said she did not expect us, but her voice was thin, almost whisper-like. My sister went to her side and knelt down, asking if she was all right. Mom nodded but kept glancing toward the hallway like something there was distracting her. I followed her gaze and noticed a stack of old photo albums spread across the dining table. When I asked her about the phone call, she just shook her head and said she must have been half asleep. But I could see her hands trembling slightly as she reached for a glass of water. She said something about Dad leaving early that morning to run errands, but his truck was still parked outside. That small detail sent a chill through me. I exchanged a look with my sister, and without saying a word, we both knew we had to check the rest of the house. In the study, everything was exactly as Dad kept it. Papers, neatly stacked, tools hung in precise rows on the wall, and the faint smell of motor oil lingered in the air. On the desk lay an open notebook filled with dates and short notes in his handwriting. Most of it looked like lists of chores or appointments until one entry near the bottom caught my eye. It said simply, "Cabin key under floorboard, remember before they find out." I stared at the words until they started to blur. My sister leaned over my shoulder and read them too, then looked at me with that same uneasy expression she had back in her kitchen. We both turned toward the floorboards by the desk, and without speaking I knelt down and started feeling along the edges until I found one that moved slightly when pressed. I pried it open, and inside was a small metal key attached to a faded leather tag with the same date written on it as the photo. Mom called from the other room asking what we were doing, but neither of us answered right away. I held up the key and my sister whispered that we should go to the cabin. She said it in a way that sounded less like a suggestion and more like a compulsion, as if something deep in her needed to know the truth no matter what it was. Standing there in that dim study with the dust floating through the light, I realized I wanted to know too. We left the house after making sure Mom was settled with her tea and blanket, though she kept asking where we were going. My sister told her that we just needed to pick something up from town and would be back soon. It was not exactly a lie, but it was not the truth either. I hated the way she looked at us as we stepped out the door, that faint suspicion mixed with worry. I promised we would call later, even though I had no idea what we might be walking into. The map app said the cabin was 2 hours north near a lake I had never heard of. My sister drove this time, her hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary, while I stared out the window watching the scenery shift from suburban houses to wide fields and finally dense forest. Neither of us said much until the radio started playing a song Dad used to hum while working in the garage. It made my chest tighten in a way I could not describe, so I asked her to turn it off. She nodded and did not say a word. When we reached the turnoff, the road narrowed into gravel that crunched under the tires. The air smelled like pine and wet earth. A faded wooden sign at the entrance read "Lakeside Retreat," though the only thing retreating seemed to be time itself. The cabin appeared after a bend in the road, small and weathered but still standing. Its roof sagged slightly in the middle and the paint had peeled to the color of driftwood. despite that the place felt oddly familiar, like something half-remembered from a dream. We parked near the porch and got out. The silence, there was heavy, no birds, no wind, just the faint lapping of water from somewhere beyond the trees. My sister pulled the key from her bag and looked at me as if asking for permission. I nodded and she unlocked the door. The hinges groaned as it opened, revealing a narrow interior filled with dust and the faint smell of cedar. Everything inside was neatly arranged but clearly untouched for years. There were 2 chairs, a small table, a wood stove, and a shelf lined with fishing gear. She began to wander slowly through the room, tracing her fingers along the dusty table. I looked around for anything that might explain why Dad had come here or why he wanted to keep it hidden. On the shelf beneath a stack of old magazines I found a small tin box. Inside were folded papers, photographs, and a small black notebook tied with twine. The papers looked like old receipts and letters, some with names I did not recognize. The notebook, though, felt heavier in my hands, like it carried weight beyond its size. I untied the twine and opened it. The first page had Dad's handwriting and a single sentence. "If you are reading this, then you already know too much." My breath caught for a second. I read the next few lines, which were written in the same precise script he used for grocery lists. He wrote about someone named Ellen and about a promise he made years ago to keep something safe. He mentioned the lake, the cabin, and something he called the arrangement. My sister came over and leaned close, reading over my shoulder. Her eyes widened and she whispered that Ellen was Mom's middle name, but that did not make sense because he wrote about her as if she were someone else. The entries were scattered between notes about repairs and strange lines like "check mailbox at mile marker 20 and do not tell them about the photograph." The handwriting grew messier toward the end, almost rushed. The last entry simply read, "running out of time." We sat in silence for a while, each trying to make sense of what we had just read. The air inside the cabin felt warmer, now heavy with our breathing and the faint creak of the wooden floor. My sister said maybe Dad had some kind of breakdown years ago that he never told anyone about. But I was not so sure. There was something methodical in those notes, something deliberate. When I stepped outside for air, the afternoon sun was sliding lower, casting long stripes of light across the lake. The water was still as glass except for one small ripple near the dock where something floated just below the surface. I walked closer and realized it was an old metal box chained to one of the posts. It looked like it had been there a long time, rusted but intact. I called my sister over and pointed to it. She crouched beside me, staring at the box, then at the chain that disappeared into the water. She said we should not touch it, at least not yet. But the look on her face betrayed that same curiosity that had pulled us this far. I told her we needed to know what was inside because whatever Dad was hiding might be in that box. As I reached for the chain, she grabbed my arm and said maybe we should wait until tomorrow because the sun was already fading and the thought of being here after dark made her uneasy. I looked out over the lake where the sky had turned orange and I realized she was right. The air was cooling fast and shadows were stretching across the clearing. We decided to stay at the cabin overnight. The thought of sleeping there made me uneasy, but leaving felt worse. We built a small fire in the stove and ate the sandwiches we had brought with us. The silence outside deepened until it was just the crackle of wood and the occasional pop from the stove. Later, when my sister finally drifted off to sleep on the couch, I sat by the window staring out at the dark shape of the lake. I could still see the faint glimmer of that chain under the moonlight, swaying gently with the water as if something down there was breathing. And for the first time in years, I felt like I did not really know who my father was. The night at the cabin stretched on forever and I barely slept. Every time the fire died down and the darkness thickened, I would hear small sounds outside the window, the faint creak of the dock or the soft lap of water against the shore. My sister slept with her arm over her face, breathing steadily, while I sat in the chair near the door trying to convince myself that everything we had found could still be explained logically. The photo, the key, the notebook, even the metal box in the lake must all have some ordinary reason to exist. That is what I told myself, but deep down I did not believe it. At first light, I stepped outside and the air hit me like a cold slap. The mist was rising off the lake, and for a few seconds the world looked unreal, suspended between water and sky. I walked down to the dock where the chain disappeared into the water. The metal box below the surface looked dull and still. I crouched down, touched the chain, and felt the cold bite of rust against my skin. Something about it felt personal, like the kind of secret a person buries because they cannot bear to destroy it but cannot keep it close either. When my sister joined me, she handed me a thermos of coffee and said she had been reading more of the notebook. She found a line that mentioned a date 10 years after the one written on the photograph, and next to it Dad had written only the word return. I asked her what she thought it meant, and she said maybe he came back here every year. I did not have the heart to tell her that might explain why he always had those unexplained weekend trips when we were growing up. We agreed we had to open the box. The padlock was rusted but still intact. I tried pulling at it, but it would not budge. We took turns using a small hammer we found inside the cabin's tool chest. After several hits, the lock cracked and fell apart. The chain slid free with a hiss as water poured from the box's edges. Together we hauled it onto the dock. Inside, wrapped in plastic, were several envelopes and a faded red scarf. The envelopes were sealed, and each was labeled with a date spanning more than 20 years. The first was addressed simply to E. My sister hesitated before opening it, but curiosity won. Inside was a letter in Dad's handwriting. It started with a confession. He wrote about meeting someone named Ellen before he married Mom. He said they had a child together, a daughter, but circumstances forced them apart. He claimed he had been sending money every year, quietly keeping track of them from afar, but that after Ellen passed away he lost contact with the daughter completely. He wrote that he could not tell Mom because he feared it would destroy the family. My sister dropped the letter and stepped back as if it had burned her. She asked if I thought it was true, and I said I did not know, but the handwriting was undeniably his. The following envelopes contained receipts, letters, and one small photograph of a woman who looked vaguely like Mom but younger and softer, holding a baby wrapped in a red scarf. The same scarf now lay limp and wet on the dock beside the box. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The wind had picked up and the water rippled with streaks of sunlight breaking through the clouds. Finally she said that this meant we had another sister somewhere out there. I could hear the disbelief in her voice, but also something else. Hurt, maybe jealousy, confusion, all tangled together. She said that if Mom knew this it would destroy her, and that we needed to keep it quiet until we understood everything. We spent the rest of the morning sorting through the papers, trying to piece together a timeline. The last dated entry was from only a few months ago, which meant Dad had been coming here recently, still maintaining this secret life, all while living with Mom as if nothing were wrong. My mind kept replaying small memories, like the times he would disappear for a weekend and return with a faraway look, or when the phone would ring late at night and he would step outside to answer it. By noon we packed everything back into the tin box except for the notebook, which I tucked into my jacket. We drove home in silence. When we reached the house, Mom was sitting by the window just as we had left her. She smiled when she saw us, but I could tell by her eyes that she knew we had found something. She asked quietly if we went to the cabin, and I said yes. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea for us, and then she said she had something to tell us before we asked too many questions. She said she had always known about the cabin. She knew about the woman too, but not everything. She had made peace with it decades ago because she thought it was all in the past. Then she said she recently found an envelope in Dad's coat with a photograph of a young woman who looked about 20, and that is when she realized the past was not as far away as she believed. My sister asked where Dad was now. Mom said she did not know. He had left the night before, saying he needed to clear his head, and she had not heard from him since. The house was silent after that, except for the steady ticking of the wall clock. I looked at the photo on the table, the same face from the old picture, only older now, and suddenly it hit me that Dad might have gone to find her. And for the first time since this started, I felt something that had been missing all along: fear. That night I could not stop thinking about where Dad might have gone. The idea of him driving somewhere in the dark, chasing the ghost of a secret he had kept buried for decades, felt impossible to ignore. I lay awake staring at the ceiling while the wind scraped branches against the siding, and each sound seemed to echo the same thought over and over. He was gone to find her. When dawn finally arrived, it brought no peace, just a pale light that made everything look washed out and tired. Mom barely spoke over breakfast. She stirred her tea until it went cold and said she dreamed about the lake again, which made me wonder how many nights she had been haunted by things she refused to talk about. My sister sat beside her, scrolling through her phone, looking for clues on social media, as if the missing pieces of our father's life might be floating somewhere online waiting to be found. By mid-morning she looked up and said she had found something. A public post from a small-town newspaper up north mentioned a man named Leonard who had been spotted at a gas station near Clearwater Lake. The description matched Dad exactly right down to his old fishing jacket and gray cap. The timestamp was from late the previous afternoon, which meant he was out there less than a day ago. My sister looked at me, and I knew what she was going to say before she said it. We had to go after him. Mom tried to protest, but her voice faltered, and she just nodded eventually, as if surrendering to something inevitable. I promised we would bring him home no matter what. The drive to Clearwater Lake felt longer than the road to the cabin, even though it was only a few towns farther. The highway stretched endlessly between lines of evergreens that blurred into streaks of green and gray. My sister barely spoke except to ask occasionally if I thought he would want to see us. I did not know the answer, but I said yes because the truth would have made her cry. We reached the gas station around noon. The clerk said he remembered an older man who bought coffee and a map and asked for directions to a place called Fairview Road near the water. He said the man looked nervous but polite. When I asked if he was alone, the clerk said yes, though he kept looking at his phone like he was waiting for a call that never came. Fairview Road turned out to be a narrow dirt lane that ended in a cluster of small houses near the lake. Most were run down with overgrown yards and faded paint. We drove slowly, scanning for any sign of his truck until my sister suddenly grabbed my arm and pointed. Parked under a large oak tree near the end of the lane was his old blue pickup. The sight of it hit me harder than I expected. Something about seeing that familiar truck in this unfamiliar place made my stomach twist. We pulled over and got out calling his name, but there was no response. The air smelled like rain and pine and something faintly metallic. The nearest house had a porch light flickering in daylight and curtains drawn tight. We approached cautiously and I knocked on the door. After a moment it opened just a crack. A woman in her early 20s stood there, her hair pulled back and her expression wary. She looked at us for a long moment before asking who we were. I told her we were looking for our father and gave his name. Her eyes flickered with recognition, but she said nothing right away. Then she stepped aside and motioned for us to come in. Inside the house was small but tidy. A kettle hissed softly on the stove and the faint scent of vanilla hung in the air. On the mantel above the fireplace was a framed photograph of a woman who looked like the one from the picture we found in the box, only older. Next to it was a photo of the same young woman standing beside a man I did not recognize. My sister and I exchanged a quick glance. The young woman said her name was Claire. She hesitated before saying she thought Leonard might still be around. He had shown up the previous evening asking about someone named Ellen. She told him Ellen had been her mother, but that she had passed away years ago. When she asked why he was looking for her, he said nothing at first, just looked around the room like he was seeing ghosts. Then he handed her a sealed envelope and told her to open it after he left. My heart was pounding now. I asked where he went afterward, and she said he walked down toward the lake carrying his jacket and a small leather book. He never came back. We thanked her and ran out toward the shoreline where the path curved through tall grass and ended at a small pier half hidden by reeds. The lake was calm but empty. His jacket lay folded neatly on one of the posts, and beside it was the same leather notebook we had found copies of before, now completely dry as if it had never touched water. I picked it up, and inside was a single fresh note written in his handwriting. It said, "I am sorry for the years I lost, but I cannot come home until I make this right. I hope you understand." The words blurred as my eyes filled with tears I did not expect. My sister stood beside me, holding his jacket pressed against her chest like a lifeline. She whispered that maybe he had gone out in a boat, but the shoreline was empty. The only thing moving was the water itself, breathing quietly against the dock, as if trying to hide whatever story it had just swallowed. We waited there for hours, watching the horizon fade into gray until even the ripples disappeared and the lake became still again. Then a faint light appeared on the far side of the water, a single flicker like a lantern moving slowly toward the woods before vanishing completely. My sister asked if I saw it, and I said yes, though I was not sure if it had really been there. When we finally drove back to town, the sky was darkening again. Neither of us spoke until she whispered that maybe he never meant to be found. I did not answer because I was starting to think she might be right. When we returned home, the house felt even quieter than before, as if it too had been waiting for an answer that never came. Mom was sitting in the same chair by the window, and when she saw us, she already knew we had not found him. There was no panic in her face, only that dull acceptance people wear when they have run out of ways to hope. My sister knelt by her side, explaining everything from the gas station to the house near the lake, while I stood by the doorway unable to say a word. I could not bring myself to tell her about the letter he left or the light we saw across the water, because both felt too much like something between truth and dream. That evening Mom asked to see the box from the cabin. We laid everything out on the kitchen table, the scarf, the letters, the photographs, all of it. She went through them one by one in silence, her fingers tracing each paper like she was reading Braille made of memories. When she reached the picture of the baby in the red scarf, she finally spoke. She said she had always known about the woman but not the child. She said, "Your father told me once that he had made a mistake before we were married, but that it was long buried and would never touch our lives. I wanted to believe him," she said, "but he never really stopped looking back." Hearing her say that made something click inside me. For years I had thought of Dad as distant but loyal, someone quietly content with his routines and silences. Now I wondered if that distance was guilt disguised as calm. I asked her if she thought he might come back. She said she did not know, but that if he did, it would only be when he was ready to let the past die. The next few days blurred together. My sister and I took turns checking with local authorities and calling hospitals just in case. Each time we hung up without answers, the knot in my chest grew tighter. I kept replaying that last note in my head, and every time I read the words, "I cannot come home until I make this right," I found myself asking what right even meant to him. On the fourth morning, I went back to the lake alone. The road was slick from overnight rain, and the trees dripped water like they were mourning something unseen. When I reached the shore, the mist was so thick it felt like walking through breath. The cabin was exactly as we left it, except for one thing. On the table lay a single sheet of paper folded neatly. My name was written on it in that same careful handwriting I had known all my life. I stood there for a long time before opening it. Inside was a short note. It said I was never good at telling the truth until it was too late. You deserve to live without the weight I carried. Tell your mother she was right about everything. Then at the bottom he had drawn a small map leading from the cabin to a point deeper in the woods marked only with an X. I followed the trail just as he had drawn it, winding through wet leaves and fallen branches until the trees opened into a small clearing. In the center was an old wooden bench half buried in moss, and beside it a metal marker leaning against a stone. It was simple, with no name, just a date, the same date written on the first photograph. Beneath it someone had placed a small vase holding a single artificial red flower. I understood then that Ellen had been buried there, and that Dad must have returned year after year to visit her. The guilt he carried was not only for the affair or the child, but for leaving her behind. Maybe he had promised her something long ago and spent the rest of his life trying to keep that promise, even when it cost him his peace. As I stood in that clearing, I heard a faint sound from the woods behind me, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on wet leaves. My first instinct was to call out his name, but I stopped myself. Whoever it was moved slowly, never stepping fully into view. Then the sound faded completely, leaving only the rustle of wind through the trees. I waited a few more minutes before walking back to the cabin, heart pounding with a strange mix of fear and hope. When I reached the dock, I saw something resting on the post where his jacket had been days earlier. It was the same leather notebook, now dry again and closed with the twine tied carefully around it. For a long time I just stared at it, trying to decide whether it meant he was still alive or if he had simply returned one last time to leave it behind. I took the notebook and headed home before dusk. My sister was waiting on the porch, pacing back and forth. When she saw me holding the book, her eyes widened, but I did not hand it over. I told her there was something I needed to read alone first. Inside the house, Mom was asleep in her chair, the evening light falling gently across her face. For the first time, she looked peaceful. I went upstairs to my old room and sat on the bed where I used to lie awake as a teenager, listening to my parents argue in whispers. I opened the notebook and found that most of the pages were blank except for one near the end. It said simply, "You are more like me than you know. Do not make the same mistake. Learn to tell the truth before it is too late." I closed the book and sat there for a long time, staring out the window at the fading sky. Somewhere out there he was either gone for good or finally free from whatever had haunted him. But the question that kept echoing in my mind was not about him anymore. It was about me and what truths I had been avoiding all along. The The following morning I woke up earlier than usual, the house still silent and gray with dawn. For a few minutes I sat at the edge of the bed, holding the notebook in my hands, feeling the faint impressions of his handwriting pressed into the paper. It struck me how ordinary it looked for something that had upended everything I thought I knew about my family. Downstairs I could hear the slow creak of floorboards as Mom moved toward the kitchen, and the quiet hum of the kettle beginning to boil. My sister was still asleep on the couch, surrounded by scattered papers and an empty mug that had gone cold hours ago. When I joined Mom, she handed me a cup of tea without a word. The air smelled faintly of lemon and dust, and I realized that even after all this time, life insists on moving forward whether we are ready or not. She asked if I had found anything at the cabin, and I nodded. I told her about the note, the clearing, the marker, and the flower. I left out the footsteps because some details are better kept between memory and silence. She listened without interrupting, her expression calm, but her eyes glistening slightly in the light from the window. When I finished, she reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. She said she had spent so many years pretending that love was simple when in truth it was the most complicated thing any of us ever try to hold. We spent most of the morning sorting through the remaining papers together. For every question we answered, another one appeared in its place, but somehow the need to solve it all had faded. It felt enough to simply understand that our father had been a man divided between regret and devotion, trying to hold two worlds together until they finally broke him apart. By noon we had packed the letters and photographs back into the box and sealed it with new twine. Mom said she wanted to return it to the cabin and leave it there for good. I offered to drive her. The road north was quiet that day, lined with gold leaves swirling in the wind like fragments of old memories. When we reached the lake, the water was calm again, smooth and silver under a pale sun. We carried the box to the dock and set it down beside the post. For a moment none of us spoke. Then Mom whispered something under her breath that I could not quite hear and gently pushed the box into the water. It sank slowly, leaving behind a widening circle that shimmered for a few seconds before vanishing completely. Afterward we sat on the edge of the dock, our feet dangling above the water. The breeze was cool against my face, and for the first time since all of this began I felt something close to peace. Mom said she did not expect him to come back, but if he did she hoped it would be because he wanted to and not because guilt forced him. She looked out over the lake and said she used to think love meant never leaving, but maybe sometimes it means knowing when to let go. We stayed there until the shadows began to stretch across the water, then finally turned back toward the car. On the drive home I watched the trees slip by and thought about the note he left me. Tell the truth before it is too late. Those words had settled deep somewhere inside me. I realized how often I had chosen silence out of fear of conflict, just like him. Maybe that was the inheritance he never meant to pass on, the habit of quietness mistaken for strength. That evening I sat down with my sister and told her everything I had read in the notebook, the parts one had kept to myself out of caution. She listened in stillness, her expression softening with each sentence. When I finished she said maybe Dad had not disappeared at all, maybe he had just stepped out of the version of himself we all thought we knew. That line stayed with me because it sounded exactly like something he would have said if he could. As the days turned into weeks we heard nothing more. No phone call, no letter, no trace of him anywhere. Eventually the police closed the report, marking him as voluntarily missing. Life settled into a strange new rhythm. Mom started tending her garden again, my sister found a small apartment across town, and I began spending weekends by the lake fixing up the cabin little by little. It felt like the right place to leave things exactly as they were, yet cared for enough that they would not decay completely. Sometimes at dusk, when the air cools and the light fades, I sit on that dock and watch the water. There are evenings when the surface ripples just slightly and I imagine it is the wind, though a small part of me still believes it could be him walking somewhere beyond the trees. I no longer need proof either way. What remains now is the quiet understanding that people are far more complicated than the stories we tell about them. Love and guilt, grief and forgiveness all twist together until you cannot tell where one ends and the other begins. I suppose that is what he meant when he wrote that I was more like him than I knew. Before we left the cabin that final time, Mom asked what we should do if he ever returns. I told her we would leave the door unlocked and the light in the window burning, just enough for him to find his way back. She smiled faintly and said that sounded like something he would appreciate. I still keep that light on whenever I visit. It is a small thing, a quiet gesture of faith that even the people who vanish into their own silence might one day find a path home. And maybe that is all any of us can really do. Leave a light burning and hope that someone somewhere still remembers the way.